Hello, everyone. My name is Jada Lugo, and I am the museum educator at the Florida Holocaust Museum. Welcome to a Lunch and Learn with Holocaust Survivor Doris Fogel from the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center's Survivor Profiles. Doris was born in 1934 in Berlin, Germany. She was an only child, and she lived with her father, Alphonse, and her mother, Edith, in Berlin. Edith was 4 years old on November 9th in 1938 during Kristallnacht. Her father died when she was still a child, so Doris and her mother befriended a couple and their son, the Bosches, in Berlin, who became their ticket out of Germany, and they were able to help Doris and her mother travel to Shanghai, China, where they could go without a passport or an affidavit. And she spent part of her childhood in China, most of it under Japanese rule. And she lived in the Hangzhou ghetto in China. Welcome, Doris. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, if anyone has any questions about Doris's presentation, please send those questions to us using the comment box below, and then we'll ask those questions to Doris at the end of her presentation. Without further ado, I am going to give it over to Doris so that she can begin her presentation.
Thank you.
Welcome, Doris.
Good morning. Well, good morning.
Hi.
It's nice to be here. I did this we have done these types of presentations at our museum in Chicago, and so I am happy to share this with you. It is now more than 75 years ago that the world averted its eyes as the Nazi menace threatened to consume an entire people and then proceeded to carry out their unspeakable crimes. There was no refuge for the victims. There was no escape from the killers. And abandoned by their fellow human beings, they stood alone. For many of the survivors, our memories of that time, the memories of our youth, are painful and hurting. Dark, brooding journeys back into the kingdom of night. We lost our youth, we lost our innocence, but we did survive. And as Viktor Frankl observed, man is that being who invented the gas chambers at Auschwitz. However, he's also that being who entered those chambers upright with the Lord's Prayer or the Shema on his lips. So when all the crimes were finished, the fears realized and the cries silenced, that was the hope that remained to be remembered by the living. I was 4 years old in 1934, in 1939, I should say, November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht. That was the night of broken glass, the beginning of the end for the Jews of Europe. And until that time, my family lived quietly in Berlin, where I was born. I had already lost my father, who died as a young man when I was less than 2 years old. And my parents had owned a ladies' ready-to-wear store at that time, and my widowed mother soon was befriended by a couple and their small son. This association became a lifetime friendship, and more importantly, was the lifeline that led to my mother and me surviving Nazi Germany. On the night of broken glass, no one could have foretold what horrors and hardships the coming years would bring to millions of Jews and others. Throughout Germany and Austria that winter evening, synagogues, community centers, and Jewish-owned shops were set ablaze by the hands of hate. The next morning, the streets were a virtual ice rink of broken glass and sodden ash. The police stood by and did nothing. The firefighters rushed to the scene, ignoring property owned by Jews to instead protect buildings owned by non-Jews. Throughout Germany and Austria, 35,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps and detention facilities. 7,500 businesses and 101 synagogues were destroyed. Nearly 100 Jewish citizens were killed. And the German Reich imposed a large fine against the Jews of Germany, equaling the estimated insurance coverage of the destroyed and damaged property. And the excuse for that night's action was the assassination of Ernst von Rath, a German official in Paris, by a Jewish teenager whose parents had been rounded up by the Nazis. That was an easy answer for the destruction that night. However, we know better today. The underlying issue of what soon became the systematic slaughter of innocent people was simply hatred. Every day, I realized that I was one of the lucky ones, and I mentioned earlier that my mother had received a lifeline in the form of a couple and their son, who became like family to us. My aunt and uncle, as I came to call them, managed to arrange passage for us in January of 1939 on the ship Scharnhorst from Bremerhaven. And at that moment, we became refugees outward bound for Shanghai, China, the only place in the world that required no entry visa, or indeed that cared who came ashore in that metropolis of the East. The port city of Shanghai was for many Jews, after the terrifying events of Kristallnacht, the last refuge that could be reached without a passport or visa or affidavit, unlike the United States and Canada that had already closed their doors. All that was needed to make the journey was money for a ticket. We had to sell most of our possessions to obtain passage out of our home country. And because Nazi Germany allowed Jews only to take a few personal possessions, most stepped off the boats beautifully dressed, but penniless. For a short period during 1939, even though we were in Shanghai, our exile status was politically not yet apparent. We had valid German passports, even though a red stamped J was on the facing page of my mother's passport. You see the red J on my mother's passport. And actually on the second page on the bottom right, you see my name. And that was actually my birth certificate. So we had, as I say, valid German passports, even though a red stamp was facing a page of my mother, along with the red stamped Sarah above her name. You see, the Nazis identified every Jewish woman as Sarah and every Jewish man as Israel, and you simply lost your identity. And then Germany passed a new law that invalidated our passports and removed citizenship from us. We became stateless persons, and that meant, especially in the first half of the last century, that we were non-persons. I tell my audience when I'm speaking here that a few years ago, Germany offered us citizenship again. And to date, I still only know one person that has accepted a dual citizenship with Germany. Not I. I have an American citizenship. And with all this stuff that I had, memorabilia that is now in our exhibit that I have given to the museum here, the one piece of paper that stays with me is my citizenship, which I received in 1952, and that will be buried with me. In the years between 1939 and 1941, approximately 20,000 European Jews fled to Shanghai, one of the few safe havens in the world where one could go to escape the Nazis. Unfortunately, my grandparents, like so many other elderly people, could not and did not believe the rumors of the coming horrors and chose to stay in Germany. Shortly after the end of the war, we were notified that my father's parents died at Dachau. And it was almost 50 years later, on my first trip back to Berlin, that I found out that my mother's father died at the Sachsenhausen camp in Germany. Now remember, I was 4 years old in 1939. I am now 87, soon turning 88. So my memories of Germany were non-existent, and Shanghai became my home. I attended an English-speaking Jewish school, which was built for the refugee children by Sir Horace Kaduri, a wealthy Jewish philanthropist from Hong Kong. I made friends, I played sports, I was active in school activities in general. We saw American movies and we read books. I was happy, as were my school friends, because none of us knew that we were poor, nor did we feel deprived because we simply didn't know any better. And I can tell you at this point too, that the principal of our school, Lucy Hartwig, the most important thing for her was to teach us how to speak English, because the hope was when the war finally ended that everybody would end up in America or another English-speaking country. When World War II started in 1941, the Japanese occupied Shanghai, and being allies of Nazi Germany mandated that all Jewish refugees live in a poverty-stricken, filthy, and unsanitary area of Shanghai called Hongqiu. From 1944 on, sanitation, food, and nutrition in the Hongqiu ghetto were very poor. Malnutrition and disease were rampant, many dying from scarlet fever, typhoid, or malnutrition. And in total, 2,000 Jewish refugees died in Shanghai between 1938 and 1948. And of these, 1,700 in the Hongqiu ghetto, many from starvation. In this 1 square mile area lived 20,000 refugees as prisoners of war who were not allowed to leave the area without special permission from the Japanese. Overcrowding, poverty, hunger, disease, and even prostitution became facts of life. The greatest threat to the Jewish refugees occurred on July the 19th, 1942, when a German U-boat came into Shanghai harbor carrying SS Colonel Joseph Meisinger, the infamous butcher of Warsaw, to serve as representative of the Gestapo from Tokyo to Shanghai. His mission was to pressure the Japanese to liquidate the Hongqiu ghetto of its Jewish inhabitants. And the plan, never implemented, involved rounding up Jews in the synagogues on Rosh Hashanah, loading them on the ships to either starve or to place them in concentration camps. These plans were realistic, as the Japanese had already set up camps for thousands of Chinese prisoners. Fortunately, the Japanese Vice Consul Shibota was not interested in Meisinger's plans, and the SS had no real power in Shanghai. Life in Shanghai was primitive. Staying healthy was a constant problem. Food was rationed and obtained mostly from a soup kitchen. And I remember fighting with my cousin about a piece of bread. And after all, he was a growing boy, and it was felt that he should get more to eat than I. I was so undernourished that at the age of 13, when I arrived in the United States, I weighed 65 pounds. Head lice was a common occurrence among a lot of the school children, and I remember vividly having my hair cleaned with turpentine to rid me of the lice, and when that didn't work, having my head shaved. In the camp where my mother, aunt, uncle, cousin, and I lived, we had a small room. 5 of us lived in that room. That is the house. There were probably 10 families living in that house. We ate there, we slept there, and we washed in there. And for all the years that we were in the camp, we had to boil our water for drinking water, heat our water for washing our bodies, and cook our meals on a little Chinese stove stoked with little egg-shaped coals. There was no flush toilet, and we were expected to use the honey pot that the other inhabitants of the lane were accustomed to using. The honey pot was a portable toilet, and every morning a Chinese worker would come around to collect the excrement, which was later turned into fertilizer. Temperatures in the summer could reach 125 degrees, and in winter it was around the freezing mark without no heat available. We lived among the starving Chinese citizens in a city without benefit of running water and modern sanitation facilities, and we lived this ghetto life all through the war, including bombings by American planes in 1945. The unexpected happened this time on July the 17th, 1945. Shortly before the war ended, our ghetto became the target. U.S. Air Force B-17s intended to knock out a Japanese military radio station located near our ghetto. Unfortunately, they missed, bringing death and destruction into our area. I was in school at the time, and to this day, I can remember crouching under our desks for protection. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was actually only 2 minutes, we heard the all clear siren. It was a couple of days before we were reunited with our parents. A month later, 15th of August, after the United States dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito announced the unconditional surrender of Japan. And on the 2nd of September, President Harry Truman officially proclaimed VJ Day as the Japanese surrender was signed aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri at 10:30 a.m. Peace is here, and shouts of joy rang through the ghetto. It was like a dream, and it seemed unreal. But when peace came to Shanghai, so did the realization of what had happened in Europe. Rage and anguish was intense as people discovered their families and communities had perished. News that millions of Jews had been killed in German concentration camps trickled into Shanghai, and the Shanghai Jewish Chronicle printed a series of articles about how Jews had been gassed to death and then incinerated in the camps. Shudders of fear and horror rattled through the ghetto. Prayer meetings were held in all the synagogues to honor those who had perished. People were filled with a gnawing anxiety about the fates of their relatives in Europe. Most had heard nothing from any of them since the outbreak of the war. Fears deepened as lists of survivors were posted and published. My mother and I left Shanghai for the United States in April of 1947 on a converted American troop ship, the SS General Gordon, and arrived in San Francisco on May 17, 1947. The family that sponsored us lived in Peoria, Illinois, and that is where we would begin our life in America. And at this point, I have to tell you, right now, our museum has a marvelous Shanghai exhibit that has been running for a few months and that is going to be there for till next year. A few weeks ago, I received a text from the museum saying 2 ladies had gone to look at the exhibit. And at one point, there's a story about me, there are pictures, and one picture that has been floating around is of me and my cousin on the ship from Germany, Bremerhaven, to Shanghai. One of the 2 ladies said to the other, "You know, I remember my grandparents telling us that they sponsored a woman and her daughter from Shanghai to Peoria, and that woman and daughter was me." And I have met the lady, I've had lunch with her, we've talked about similarities of people that we know. And at one point I asked her, gave her a name, "Was this your mother?" And she said, yes. She and I were friends growing up as teenagers. And then a couple of weeks later, a young man looked at the exhibit and he looked at the picture and he said, "That's my grandfather." And it's amazing. And he happens to live in Chicago. And of course, I know his father very well. And my cousin, who's 92 and lives in Cleveland, is still living. So that whole family came to Chicago and I gave them a tour of the exhibit. Our first glimpse of paradise was when we stopped in Hawaii on our way to America. Imagine, to finally turn on a faucet of water and have a drink of water without having to boil it first. On May 17th, 1947, we passed under the Golden Gate Bridge. It was an unforgettable morning. The sun was shining, and after having been seasick the better part of the voyage, we were all out on deck waiting for our first glimpse of America. Everyone cheered, and then we cried. It was hard to believe that we were here at last. And then we cried again for all those who didn't make it, for our countless relatives and friends who had ended up in Hitler's ovens. A few years ago, a friend of mine, also a survivor, was telling her story, and in it she mentions the 3 B's: bed, bath, and bread. Listening to her speak of the 3 B's reminded me of the day that we left Shanghai. I thought my bed would walk out by itself because it was so infested with bed bugs. Would the time ever come that I would have a clean bed that I didn't have to share with my mother? Took several more years before we could afford separate beds. The second B related to a bath. I finally got to take my first bath upon our arrival in San Francisco. But again, it would take a couple of years before we were able to have our own bathroom. And the third B, of course, was bread. The food that I was given was so plentiful and rich, didn't take long for me to become a pimple-faced teenager. Zakor, the Hebrew word zakor means remember. Never forget, and do not let others forget. Always remember that the impossible, the unthinkable happened, and it could happen again. Our Shanghai history contains many lessons. Lessons about the strength of the human spirit, about hope and courage, and giving your best even when times are the hardest, about the importance of community, about dignity and cultural heritage, and about our Jewishness and about ourselves. And more widely, our historical experience shows that appeasement of bloody tyrants does not work, that violating the rights of minorities does violence to us all, and that each citizen has a civic responsibility to impose intolerance and prejudice toward any religious, racial, or ethnic group, to stand up and be counted, and to have the courage to speak out against it. Unfortunately, we live in dangerous and volatile times, and we face challenges that promise to be with us for many years to come. Dictators still threaten the peace, intolerance and fanatic hatred still abound, and the persecution of innocent minorities remains a lamentable fact. Survivors are concerned about how the events of our lives will be described when we are no longer here to personally tell our stories. We have memories of our childhood, of vibrant and vital Jewish communities, of grandparents, parents, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles. We each have our story to tell about surviving, and we have our own history of building new lives. We want to pass along to the next generation the stories of our experience, and we want to be sure that they include stories about Jewish life and culture before the Holocaust. There are always a couple factors. Well, there are a couple of achievements of survivors that I always like to focus upon. The first is the strength that our parents had to pick up the pieces of their lives that had been so cruelly interrupted and go on with life. The second deals with external factors after the war. Both America and the state of Israel offered us freedom and opportunity. And after losing so much, we were deeply grateful for the generosity of these nations. We can look back now and be proud of what we have given in return, not just our work and our successes, not just our most precious possession, our children and grandchildren, but our spirit, our example, and our honor. We are respected today in this country and throughout the world because the community of mankind knows that we Holocaust survivors have something very important to impart. The experience of the Holocaust was unique, but has great meaning for all who treasure a free world and place where every human being is safe to live. Especially when I speak to students, which I do very frequently at our museum, I like to tell them, intolerance kills. Even one discriminating thought, one discriminating statement, or one scapegoating judgment can snowball into the slaughter of millions. Treat others how you want to be treated. Take care of yourself, but don't forget about others. And lastly, overlook your physical sight of a person and see how they really are inside. And above all, please always be a person that cares, because in the world, many people do terrible things, but it's because of all the people that do good things that we can survive and have hope in ourselves and others. So please be a person that cares. I've often been asked, why do I make these presentations, which aren't always easy to do? It's very simple. We must remember. You see, when I speak to children, they are the last generation to hear this firsthand. Who will be left to teach and tell the next generation or the generations to follow? The answer is quite simply, each and every child sitting in that auditorium is the one that does that. I also think it is very important that we preserve the past. The Holocaust was the most appalling crime against humanity of the 20th century, if not of the whole history of mankind. It must never be forgotten. In addition to the millions of Jews who lost their lives, an estimated 5.5 million others also died, and these included gypsies, Jehovah's Witness critics of the Nazi government in Germany, the mentally and physical handicapped. In addition, there were thousands and thousands who survived, but who'd been exposed to such horrific cruelty that it is impossible for us to imagine. I will close now. I've spoken long enough with a couple of poems. There is no answer to Auschwitz, no answer to hatred, brutality, and murder. There is no answer, only questions. Why? Why did so many innocents have to die? Out of the ashes of death and destruction, out of the flames that engulfed us came the survivors whose eyes have seen the horrors and whose ears have heard the screams. They tried to silence us, but our voices are still heard. They tried to destroy us, but we would not die. The chain has not been broken. The sheep led to slaughter are now lines, proud and strong. The yellow star of shame is now the courageous badge of life. They killed the Jews, but Judaism survives. They burnt the Torah, but the words endure. The 6 million who perished, their voices silenced forever, left us a legacy. We must remember. We are the survivors who lived to tell the tale. We are the remnants who bear witness to the world. And if there is to be peace in the world, there must be peace in nations. And if there is to be peace in the nations, there must be peace in the cities. And if there is to be peace in the cities, there must be peace between neighbors. And if there is to be peace between neighbors, there must be peace in your home. And if there is peace in your home, there must always be peace in your heart. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doris, for sharing your story. What a really beautiful poem to end with, sharing that. We do have some more pictures in your presentation. Would you like for me to share those?
You can if you want to, very quickly, and I'll explain to you what they are.
Perfect. No, so let me share the slides that we have.
That is a picture of the lanes in Shanghai, and that picture was taken about 5 years ago. That's current. That's my cousin and I with my aunt. Okay, the picture on the right, on the bottom right, is my cousin and I on our way to Shanghai, and that picture has been everywhere. The picture on the left is my mother and I on our way to America. I am a very small person. I'm only 4 feet 11 and a half. And so I didn't grow much after that picture. And I think the last slide is my mother's citizenship paper. That's it.
Beautiful photos. They're beautiful. So again, thank you so much. If you were just now joining us in the audience from via Facebook, we are speaking with Doris Fogel. She is a Holocaust survivor, and she's joining us from Illinois today. She is a frequent speaker at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center in Illinois. So thank you so much for watching. So we have a few questions that we want to talk about. First, when did you begin sharing your story with the public and with students?
It's very interesting. I have 3 children. Almost 60, 68, 58, and 55. When my daughter, who is my baby, was a junior in high school, I chaperoned a German-speaking class to Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And up until that time, I actually had a hard time speaking German to a non-Jew. I still am pretty fluent in German, but to this day. And when I saw the itinerary of the trip, I said, and I knew we were going to Munich, I said to the teacher, I said, there's only one way that I will go to Munich. This whole bus has to go to Dachau. And she said, well, if you can arrange it. And I said, well, watch me. And I did. So the whole bus went to Dachau. And the only people, actually Jewish people on that trip were my daughter and I, a close friend of hers, and her mother. Now, all the kids that were on that trip I had known since 2nd, 3rd grade. These are juniors in high school. And they came up to me afterwards and saying, oh, we didn't know Mrs. Fogel, blah, blah. All right. I came home and I said to my husband, who was born and raised in Indiana, you know what? It's time. It's time that I start speaking. And there really aren't any schools in Fort Wayne, Indiana that I haven't spoken to. I speak all over the country. I was the executive director of a Jewish federation and have done Yom HaShoah services all over the country. And, you know, it's been my life work, and everything that I do or have done, whether it's federation or being president of my temple, I'm paying back what the community and Americans did for us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. We've received some questions from our audience.
Okay.
A few comments. Someone has mentioned that they did not realize that China took in Jewish refugees, and they thank you so much for sharing your story. They say that we must never forget the innocent lives taken during the Holocaust. See, it's amazing to have to be able to share this perspective from your perspective from the Shanghai ghetto. We do have a speaker, actually, the Florida Holocaust Museum, who was in the Shanghai ghetto. Her name is Betty Gorbenshikov. Someone asked a question. Maybe you might remember this family. It seems like they had some family that were also in the Shanghai ghetto. They ask you, do you know Irene and Bridget Gutat, the Gutat
Now,
family.
here's the thing. There were 20,000 people there.
Wow, yes.
If they were my age and were my classmates, I would know them. I met a few others. The first reunion that Shanghai landers, as we're called, had was in Israel. And I saw many people there that I hadn't even known where, they had gone. People went all over. But over the years, there had been a number of reunions. And at one point, there was a reunion in the Catskills, and a friend of mine and I signed up to go there. But as it turned out, one of my children was having a baby, and I never missed the birth of a grandchild. I have 8 grandchildren. And so we didn't go, but our names were on the list. And there were close to 15 of us that had reunited. And over the years, the next many years, we met in a different country or a different city in America. But we were all in the same grade, we're all the same age. But I'm sorry to say, at this point, I think there are 4 of us left. I mean, and another thing, people, if they would like to learn a little bit more about the Shanghai ghetto, watch the PBS documentary, Harbor from the Holocaust. It came out last September, September, I was in New York, the September before COVID, and it was finally released September last year. And I had gone to New York to be filmed and, interviewed for that as well. And one of the gentlemen in the program, Klaus Hirsch, lives in New York, and we are still very close friends. We've been friends since we were 5, 6, 7 years old, and we're now 87.
Wow, it's amazing that you've been able to stay in touch with others that were in the Shanghai ghetto. Some more questions from viewers. One, we have it's not really a question, but we do have some viewers watching from the UK. They say hello. Thank you for joining us from the UK. That's wonderful. So another question is, what did your mother and your aunt and uncle do when they were in Shanghai to earn money? Was that even possible?
Well, my mother worked in a soup kitchen, and she's was a college educated woman. And I understand that my aunt and uncle, with other people, for a short time had some kind of a grocery store. And I just learned recently, I've been on, many webinars or conferences and talked to people. There were actually, I would say, 3 different groups in Shanghai. You had the people with the yeshiva. They got a lot of money and they lived much better lives than we did. Then there were the people that came a little bit later and had money with them and were able to get jobs and do things. And then there were us who had nothing, but we eventually, when Japan, took over, we all ended up in the Hongqiu ghetto. And I think right now they're working on doing a virtual, which they did with the president of our museum, Fritzy, who just passed away recently. And I mean, when I watched that virtual, on my, it was like I was walking through Auschwitz and I was walking. Well, now they're working on doing one with me, starting out in Berlin and then Bremerhaven, which is where I sailed from, and then Shanghai. So I'll be going to those places if COVID ever slows down.
Amazing. From that, we also have a few more questions
Go ahead.
about your experiences in the Shanghai ghetto.
I was a school child.
Right.
Go
for
ahead, us, you know what? As kids, we were first of all, we were able to go to classes because Sir Horace Kadoorie built this school for us. And we had your teachers from Europe. And let me tell you, Yara, my mother, who was a college educated woman, as I say, when we came to the first of all, we did not have notebooks like children have now. Our parents made our books out of paper books. A couple of the sheets of mine happened to be in the exhibit that's now there. One is from when I learned how to write Hebrew, which I don't know at all anymore, and English. All right. When we came to America, my mother took me to the Board of Education to be tested, right? At that point, I weighed maybe 70 pounds. I'm 4'11" and a half, and I get tested, and they tell her, well, she tested to be a junior in high school. And my mother said, where does a 13-year-old belong? It was 8th grade. That's where I started my education in America.
That's incredible that you were able to have an educational experience while you were still in the Shanghai ghetto.
We had, I learned French. I mean, yeah, it was, well, when I came to America, you would have thought that I was British because I had a very, very British accent. That's what we learned. But I worked very hard to lose it because I never wanted anybody to, where are you from? That I'd have to go into a long explanation of where are you from? That's just not me.
Right. No, that we understand that. So, when you were in the Shanghai ghetto, do you remember how you were treated by the others in the
Japanese?
ghetto for being Jewish?
Jewish really didn't have much to do with it. It was just that we were the refugees, and the people that did get jobs or did do something had to go through the Japanese. And there was one man in particular, Goya, who was in charge of all the, stand at the corner with a gun with a bayonet. And, you know, if he didn't like what you said or what you looked like, he might poke you. No, that's kind of basically what it was.
Wow, absolutely. I feel like I've actually heard of that person before when our survivor Betty Grebenshikov has spoken about her experiences. It's so interesting to hear those kind of parallels. One more question that we have. Have you been back to Shanghai since?
All my friends have been back. I, over the years, didn't go back because it was so expensive to go back. Now I will be, when they are doing this thing, I will go back. And as my children have all said, if you go back, you're flying first class, lady, because you're not going to do. And actually, I was at a very special luncheon the other day at the museum. I was invited, I guess, as a special guest. And one of the women there said that she had lived in Berlin for 6 years studying. She works for the museum. And she said, I'm going with you. I will be accompanying you. I said, God, they better get that trip done early. I mean, after all, I'm going to be 88 next May. So let's get moving.
No, that's amazing. I really look forward to hearing more about that if hopefully that all takes place.
Oh, I hope so.
Absolutely. Does anyone in your family plan on continuing and being that second or third generation sharing your family story?
I don't think so. I mean, they all, the day after, as it happened, all 8 of my grandchildren were home for Thanksgiving, which is very unusual. You know, someone works in Denver and the kids are in college, but all of them came to the museum with my daughter and son-in-law, and I gave them a tour of our Shanghai exhibit, which is absolutely wonderful. Our curator, Ariel, is just a wonderful person, and she did an outstanding job.
That is amazing. And it's especially impactful to hear that even if your own family does not continue sharing that story, or like you are, talking to students and things like that in a very public way, you're still, like you are being recorded, like your story is still being
Well,
preserved.
that's what's important, and the kids all know about it. They've all heard me speak, but yeah.
Absolutely. So we have apparently we're getting a lot of comments from the UK. That's really great that we have a lot of viewers from the UK.
That's interesting, right?
It is very interesting. That's really wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us from the UK and wherever you're joining us today. I'm in Florida and Mrs. Fogel is in Illinois. It's amazing that we're all able to
In Chicago, Northbrook.
Yes, you're in Chicago, in the Chicago area. That's amazing. We have some comments. Someone says that their grandfather was from Berlin. They were transported to Theresen, and eventually they came to the UK and made their life there. They've actually visited the Holocaust Museum here in the Florida Holocaust Museum in St. Petersburg. Everyone is just so glad to be able to hear your story and the story of the Shanghai ghetto. We must never forget.
Well, I will come visit your museum. I have a granddaughter that goes to the University of Tampa, which I understand is close to where you are.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we are close enough to Tampa Bay. We are in the whole Tampa Bay area. And so and we also work with survivors all over the state of Florida, with schools all over the state of Florida.
Good.
And so it's amazing to be able to connect with you and partner with the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center to bring some of their speakers over here to us, and also the other way around. We actually have a presentation coming up with one of our frequent speakers. Her name is Jacqueline Albin, and she has, of course, every Holocaust survivor story is unique. And so her story is about growing up in France during World War II, and and she lived in hiding. It's a really incredible story.
She was a hidden child.
Yes, so she was a hidden child, and she'll be sharing her story for the audience in Illinois at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center coming up very soon on the 22nd of this month. So if we have a couple more minutes for questions, please send those in now before we let Mrs. Fogel go for the rest of her day. I just want to say thank you so much as we wait for those last questions. If there's any last minute questions, thank you so much, Doris, for sharing your story. It's an incredible experience to be able to hear. Very excited to be able to partner.
Yesterday, just to give you, for instance, I was out to dinner with a friend, and we met 3 ladies, all Jewish. One was 97 years old. Not one of them knew about the Jews in Shanghai. That so many of us, we were lucky because America did not let us in anymore. Well, I had 2 aunts and uncles that died on the St. Louis. That, if you're familiar with the St. Louis ship, of course you are, trying to come to America, and they never made it. So there are so many stories out there.
Yes, and we are so glad to be able to bring the story public for them to hear of the unique stories of Holocaust survivors. So it looks like I'm just making sure we have any questions. Please send those in while we still have time. Thank you so much for watching. And I think this is about the end of our presentation today. Again, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, for taking the time, for joining us from Illinois. Yes, it's nice to be able to work with you and meet with you. And a special thank you to the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for helping us bring this program to our audience. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you'll be able to join us again for our next program, our next Lunch and Learn with a Holocaust Survivor. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Everyone.